The sharp crack of palm against cheek echoed through the 47th floor of Jefferson Holdings, silencing the bustling Chicago corporate office in an instant. 65-year-old Dolores Jefferson stood motionless in her faded cleaning uniform, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth, where Jennifer Walsh's manicured hand had struck her. The white vice president's face was twisted with rage, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the violence she had just unleashed. "That'll teach you to keep your eyes where they belong, you filthy woman!" Jennifer spat, her voice dripping with contempt as she towered over the older black woman. Around them, employees had frozen mid-conversation, some averting their eyes in embarrassment, others watching with barely concealed satisfaction. The whispers started immediately, hushed conversations about knowing one's place. And what did she expect? But Dolores Jefferson didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or beg for mercy. Instead, she slowly wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her weathered hand and looked directly into Jennifer's eyes with a calmness that seemed to unsettle the younger woman. What Jennifer Walsh didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she had just slapped the mother of Marcus Jefferson, the very CEO who owned the building they stood in. More importantly, she had just triggered a chain of events that would bring down everything she had built her career upon. The secret Dolores had been keeping for 3 weeks was about to explode with the force of righteous fury, and everyone who had participated in or witnessed this moment of cruelty was about to learn that sometimes justice wears a janitor's uniform. 3 weeks earlier, Dolores Jefferson had walked through the gleaming lobby of Jefferson Holdings with a fake identification card clipped to her modest cleaning uniform. At 65, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades working with her hands, but her sharp eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the empire her son had built. The company bore their family name, yet she had entered it as Dorothy Williams, a woman desperate for work who had accepted a position in the janitorial staff through a temp agency. The decision to go undercover hadn't been made lightly. For months, Marcus had been receiving anonymous letters and complaints about racial discrimination within his company, accusations he'd initially dismissed as disgruntled employee grievances. But when 3 separate wrongful termination lawsuits were filed by black employees in the same quarter, each citing identical patterns of harassment and discriminatory treatment, Dolores had convinced her son to let her investigate personally. She would spend 3 weeks as an invisible observer, documenting the culture that existed beneath the polished corporate veneer. From her first day, the differences in treatment were stark and undeniable. When white employees entered the elevator, they were greeted with warm smiles and friendly good mornings. When Dolores and her fellow black janitors stepped inside, conversations stopped, and eyes deliberately looked anywhere but at them. It was as if they were ghosts, present but not quite human enough to acknowledge. Jennifer Walsh, the Vice President of Human Resources, embodied this attitude most clearly. Dolores watched as the woman distributed work assignments each morning, consistently assigning the most physically demanding and degrading tasks to employees of color while giving lighter duties to their white counterparts. Jennifer's voice would shift when addressing black employees, becoming sharper, more condescending, as if she were speaking to children rather than adults. "You people need to understand that this is a professional environment," Jennifer had said during Dolores's second week, addressing the cleaning staff in a tone that dripped with disdain. "We have standards here that may be different from what you're used to." The implied insult hung heavy in the air, and Dolores watched as her fellow workers absorbed the humiliation in silence, their jobs too precious to risk with any form of protest. But Dolores wasn't just any employee. She was a woman who had built businesses, who had raised a CEO, who had fought battles that Jennifer Walsh couldn't even imagine, and she was taking careful notes of everything she witnessed, building a case that would soon shake the very foundations of the company that bore her family's name. By the second week, Jennifer Walsh had begun to notice something different about the new cleaning woman. Dolores's vocabulary was too sophisticated, her posture too confident, her responses too measured for Jennifer's preconceived notions of who belonged in a janitor's uniform. This observation didn't lead to respect or curiosity, but rather to suspicion and an intensified campaign of harassment. "Dorothy Williams," Jennifer would say, drawing out the fake name with obvious skepticism. "Tell me again where you worked before this?" The questions came daily now, probing inquiries designed to trip up what Jennifer clearly believed was some kind of deception. She couldn't put her finger on exactly what was wrong, but her instincts told her that this black woman was somehow different from the others, and that difference made her dangerous. Jennifer's response was to make Dolores's working conditions increasingly intolerable. She assigned her to clean the executive bathrooms alone, a two-person job that required hours of additional unpaid labor. She scheduled Dolores for weekend shifts without notice, then wrote her up when transportation issues made her 5 minutes late. Most cruelly, she began assigning Dolores to clean up after the monthly board meetings, requiring her to work late into the evening, disposing of confidential documents and expensive leftover catering, while Jennifer watched from her glass office, making sure the suspicious employee didn't have access to anything she shouldn't see. During these extended evening shifts, Dolores witnessed conversations that confirmed her worst fears about the company culture. She heard Jennifer on the phone with other department heads, casually discussing which black employees were problems that needed to be managed out. She watched as performance reviews were doctored, as minor infractions by black employees were blown out of proportion, while similar or worse behavior by white employees was overlooked entirely. The breaking point came when Jennifer orchestrated the termination of Michael Roberts, a 23-year-old black man who worked in accounts receivable. Michael's crime had been questioning a discrepancy in his paycheck, an overpayment that he had honestly reported to HR. Instead of thanking him for his integrity, Jennifer had used the incident as an excuse to launch an investigation into his suspicious financial behavior, ultimately firing him for attempting to manipulate company payroll systems. Dolores had watched Michael clean out his desk, tears of frustration and humiliation in his eyes as security escorted him out. That night, she made her first call to her son's personal attorney, beginning the process of building a legal case that would protect every employee who had suffered under Jennifer Walsh's discriminatory regime. But she knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough. She needed Jennifer to reveal her true nature in a way that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. The opportunity for that revelation was coming sooner than she had anticipated. The third week brought Jennifer's cruelty into full public view. It started with the monthly all-hands meeting, a corporate tradition where department heads shared updates and celebrated achievements. Dolores had been assigned to provide cleaning services during the meeting, emptying trash and maintaining the conference room while presentations continued around her. As employees filtered out during the break, Jennifer noticed Dolores collecting untouched pastries from the catering table, food that would otherwise be discarded, and which company policy explicitly allowed janitorial staff to take home. But Jennifer saw an opportunity to humiliate her suspicious employee in front of the maximum number of witnesses. "Stop right there!" Jennifer's voice cut through the casual conversations, drawing every eye in the room to where Dolores stood with a small paper bag of leftover Danish pastries. "Did anyone give you permission to take that food?" Dolores remained calm, pulling out her employee handbook and pointing to the relevant policy. Section 4.7 states that unused catering may be claimed by cleaning staff at the conclusion of events, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hostile attention now focused on her. Jennifer snatched the handbook away and threw it on the floor. "Don't you dare quote policy to me, you thieving—" She caught herself before using the slur she clearly wanted to employ, but the intent was clear to everyone in the room. "People like you always think you can take whatever you want. You probably learned that behavior in whatever ghetto you crawled out of." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Around the room, some employees looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they witnessed what was clearly racial harassment. Others seemed to enjoy the spectacle, nodding along with Jennifer's barely coded language. But Dolores didn't react with anger or hurt. Instead, she bent down, picked up the handbook, and carefully placed it back on the table. "Ma'am?" she said quietly. "I was simply following company policy. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding." Her phone, hidden in her uniform pocket, had been recording everything. Jennifer's face flushed with rage at what she interpreted as insubordination disguised as politeness. "Don't try to make me look bad with your fake respectability. I know what you people are really like when you think nobody's watching. You're probably stealing supplies, selling company information, who knows what else." The room had gone completely silent now, the air thick with tension as 30 corporate employees watched their HR vice president systematically destroy a black woman's dignity. Some pulled out their phones, though whether to document the abuse or simply to appear busy was unclear. What was clear was that Jennifer Walsh had just provided Dolores Jefferson with everything she needed to bring down not just one bigoted executive, but an entire system of institutionalized racism. But the worst was yet to come. As Jennifer prepared to escalate her verbal assault into something that would end careers and transform lives forever, none of them realized that Marcus Jefferson was at that very moment boarding a plane back to Chicago, alerted by his mother's trusted ally that the investigation they had planned was about to reach its explosive conclusion. The confrontation that would define Jennifer Walsh's career began 3 days after the catering incident, when Dolores Jefferson made the mistake of filing a formal complaint with the corporate ethics hotline. Jennifer discovered the complaint within hours, a violation of company policy that she didn't even attempt to hide. And her response was swift and vicious. "So you want to play games with me?" Jennifer cornered Dolores in the supply closet, her voice low and threatening. "You think you can go behind my back and make up lies about discrimination? Let me tell you something, Dorothy Williams, or whatever your real name is. I run this department, and I can make your life a living hell." Dolores continued organizing cleaning supplies, her movements steady and purposeful, despite the venom being directed at her. "I simply reported what I observed, ma'am. The hotline is available to all employees." "Don't give me that innocent act," Jennifer snapped. "I know what you're really doing here. You're probably some kind of industrial spy sent by a competitor to dig up dirt on our company. Or maybe you're working with those ambulance-chasing lawyers who keep filing these frivolous discrimination suits." The accusation was so absurd that under different circumstances, Dolores might have laughed. Instead, she turned to face Jennifer directly, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp with intelligence that clearly unsettled the younger woman. "Mrs. Walsh," she said quietly, "I am simply a 65-year-old woman trying to make an honest living cleaning offices. If that threatens you in some way, perhaps you should examine why." The psychological precision of this response sent Jennifer into a fury that attracted attention from beyond the supply closet. Her raised voice carried down the hallway, drawing colleagues who pretended to be walking past on legitimate business, but were clearly eavesdropping on the confrontation. "How dare you psychoanalyze me?" Jennifer's voice climbed to near shouting levels. "You think because you can string together a few big words, you're better than your place in life? Let me remind you exactly where you belong in this company hierarchy." Word of the confrontation spread through the office with the speed that only workplace drama can achieve. Within an hour, employees throughout the building were choosing sides, though the divisions fell along predictably racial lines. White employees largely supported Jennifer, viewing her as a strong leader dealing with a difficult employee. Black and Hispanic employees saw something much darker, a powerful woman using her position to publicly humiliate someone who couldn't fight back without losing her job. By the end of the day, Jennifer had assembled what she clearly viewed as a coalition of support. Department heads who shared her views on maintaining workplace standards rallied around her, offering to provide testimony about Dolores's suspicious behavior, and attitude problems. They scheduled an impromptu meeting for the following morning, ostensibly to discuss personnel issues, but really to coordinate their response to what they saw as a challenge to their authority. But Jennifer had fundamentally misunderstood the situation she was in. While she was building alliances based on shared prejudice and mutual protection of privilege, Dolores was methodically documenting every violation of labor law, every act of discrimination, every moment of abuse that she witnessed. More importantly, she was in daily communication with Marcus Jefferson's legal team, providing them with evidence that would soon reshape not just careers, but the entire culture of the company. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would expose 3 weeks of careful investigation, reveal the true identity of the woman Jennifer had been tormenting, and demonstrate that sometimes justice comes wearing the most unexpected disguise. All that remained was for Jennifer Walsh to make the one mistake that would trigger her complete destruction. A mistake she was about to make in front of the maximum possible number of witnesses. The 47th floor of Jefferson Holdings had never witnessed anything quite like the scene that unfolded that Monday morning. Jennifer Walsh had orchestrated what she clearly intended to be a public execution of sorts, a company-wide demonstration of what happened to employees who dared to challenge the established order. She had sent an email to every department head, requesting their presence for what she termed an important personnel matter that affects all of us. Dolores Jefferson stood in the center of the main conference room, still wearing her cleaning uniform, but somehow radiating a dignity that her tormentor couldn't diminish. Around them, nearly 50 employees had gathered, creating a circle of witnesses for what Jennifer clearly expected to be her moment of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer began, her voice carrying the false authority of someone who believed her power was absolute. "We have a serious security concern in our midst. This woman," she gestured dismissively at Dolores, "has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of our company operations, filing false reports of discrimination, and generally creating a hostile work environment for legitimate employees." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and several employees shifted uncomfortably. They had all witnessed Jennifer's behavior over the past weeks, but confronting it directly would require a courage that few corporate workers possessed. Jennifer continued her performance, clearly relishing what she believed was her moment of absolute control. "I have documented evidence of insubordination, policy violations, and what I believe to be industrial espionage. This woman has no business being in a facility of this caliber, and I am terminating her employment immediately." It was then that Dolores spoke, her voice cutting through Jennifer's tirade with quiet authority. "Before you continue, Mrs. Walsh, perhaps you should know who you're addressing." Something in her tone made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. This wasn't the voice of a defeated cleaning woman begging for mercy. This was the voice of someone who held cards that hadn't yet been played. Jennifer laughed, a harsh sound that revealed her growing desperation to maintain control of the situation. "Oh, this should be good. Let me guess. You're going to tell us you're some kind of undercover journalist, maybe a civil rights activist, or perhaps—" The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that somehow cut through Jennifer's monologue like a sword. Marcus Jefferson stepped out, flanked by the company's legal counsel and board of directors. His expression was calm, but those who knew him well could see the controlled fury burning behind his professional facade. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of ownership, "she's going to tell you that she's the woman who co-founded this company 30 years ago. Perhaps she's going to explain that she's been conducting an investigation into systemic discrimination at the request of the CEO. Or maybe," his eyes locked with Jennifer's terrified gaze, "she's simply going to introduce herself as my mother." The silence that followed was absolute. 50 corporate employees held their collective breath as the implications of Marcus Jefferson's words sank in. Jennifer Walsh's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and finally, the pale terror of someone who realizes they have just destroyed their entire career in the most public way possible. Dolores Jefferson removed her cleaning cap, revealing the silver-streaked hair that she had kept carefully hidden. When she spoke, it was with the voice of a woman who had built an empire, raised a CEO, and spent 3 weeks documenting every act of cruelty that had been perpetrated in her son's name. "My name is Dolores Jefferson," she said, addressing the room but keeping her eyes on Jennifer. "I am a co-founder and major shareholder of this company. For the past 3 weeks, I have been working undercover to investigate reports of racial discrimination that threatened to destroy everything my family has built. What I found was worse than I had imagined." The room erupted in whispers, gasps, and the sound of phones being pulled out to capture what everyone recognized as a historic moment. Jennifer Walsh, the woman who had slapped a cleaning lady just minutes before, had actually struck the mother of her boss, the co-owner of the company, and one of the most powerful black women in Chicago business. The reckoning that followed would be swift, thorough, and absolutely devastating. Jennifer Walsh's fall from grace wasn't just swift. It was comprehensive, public, and irreversible. Within hours of Dolores Jefferson's identity being revealed, every news outlet in Chicago was carrying the story of the HR executive who had spent weeks abusing the company founder's mother while she conducted an undercover investigation into workplace discrimination. The video footage that employees had captured on their phones went viral within hours, showing Jennifer's shocked face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. But more damning than her surprised expression was the audio recording that Dolores had been making for 3 weeks. Hours of documented harassment, discriminatory language, and explicit discussions of how to manage out employees based on their race. Marcus Jefferson wasted no time in implementing consequences. Jennifer Walsh was terminated immediately, forfeiting all benefits and facing personal liability for the hostile work environment she had created. But her termination was just the beginning of a corporate reckoning that would reshape Jefferson Holdings from top to bottom. The legal consequences came next. Federal investigators launched a comprehensive review of the company's employment practices, using Dolores's evidence as the foundation for a broader investigation into systemic discrimination. Jennifer faced personal lawsuits from every employee she had harassed or wrongfully terminated, with Dolores's recordings providing irrefutable evidence of discriminatory intent. Within a week, Jennifer Walsh had gone from being a powerful corporate executive to being unemployable in her chosen field. No reputable company would hire someone with her documented history of racial harassment, and the viral nature of her exposure meant that her reputation preceded her wherever she went. The woman who had built her career on maintaining professional standards discovered that there were consequences for using those standards as weapons against people she considered beneath her. But the most satisfying element of Jennifer's downfall wasn't the legal consequences or the career destruction. It was the way her former allies abandoned her once her actions were exposed to public scrutiny. The department heads who had supported her discriminatory policies suddenly claimed they had been unaware of her behavior. The colleagues who had laughed at her racist jokes insisted they had been uncomfortable all along but hadn't known how to speak up. Jennifer Walsh learned what many bullies eventually discover. When you build your power on cruelty rather than competence, you have no real allies when your victims finally find the strength to fight back. She faced her consequences alone, having burned every bridge that might have provided support during her moment of greatest need. The woman who had slapped a cleaning lady because she thought she could get away with it discovered that in the modern world there are no invisible victims, only people whose power hasn't yet been revealed. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Dolores Jefferson stood before the same conference room where she had been humiliated, but the context couldn't have been more different. She now addressed the room as a recognized leader rather than an invisible worker, and her audience listened with the respect that should have been accorded to her from the beginning. "When I put on that cleaning uniform 3 weeks ago," she began, her voice carrying the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had endured and overcome, "I thought I was investigating a few bad employees. What I discovered instead was that discrimination isn't usually the result of individual prejudice. It's a system that allows prejudice to flourish unchecked." The audience, composed of employees who had witnessed her investigation and its aftermath, listened with attention that bordered on reverence. Many of them were seeing clearly for the first time how their workplace had been poisoned by unchallenged bias and how they had been complicit through their silence. Dolores continued, her tone remaining measured and thoughtful despite the passion of her message. "I could have revealed my identity on that first day and demanded respect based on my position. But respect based solely on title or wealth isn't real respect. It's just fear dressed up in polite language. Real respect comes from recognizing the inherent dignity of every human being, regardless of their job title, their bank account, or the color of their skin." She gestured toward the spot where Jennifer Walsh had slapped her, the moment that had crystallized months of systemic abuse into a single, viral act of cruelty. "That slap wasn't really about me. It was about every black woman who has ever been made to feel invisible, every person who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character, every worker who has been afraid to speak up because they needed their job more than they needed their dignity." The transformation that had taken place at Jefferson Holdings in the months following the incident was dramatic and comprehensive. New policies ensured that discrimination complaints were handled by independent investigators. Mandatory training addressed unconscious bias and created safe spaces for reporting harassment. Most importantly, the company had committed to transparency, publishing annual reports on diversity, inclusion, and the concrete steps being taken to ensure that every employee was treated with dignity and respect. "Change is possible," Dolores concluded, "but it requires courage, the courage to investigate when something seems wrong, the courage to document injustice even when it's uncomfortable, and most importantly, the courage to act when action is needed. We cannot wait for someone else to be the hero of our story. We must be willing to put on the uniform, do the work, and stand up for what's right, even when, especially when, nobody realizes we have the power to make a difference." As Dolores Jefferson's story spread beyond the walls of Jefferson Holdings, it became something larger than a single incident of workplace discrimination. It became a symbol of the power that exists within every person who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. The lesson wasn't complex, but it was profound. Dignity doesn't depend on recognition, justice doesn't wait for permission, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room is wearing the most humble uniform. In a world that judges by appearance and assumes based on position, the greatest weapon against discrimination might just be the willingness to see clearly, document carefully, and act decisively when the moment demands it. Every workplace has its Jennifer Walsh, someone who uses their position to diminish others, who mistakes cruelty for strength, who believes that power means never having to face consequences. But every workplace also has potential allies, witnesses who can choose to speak up rather than look away, bystanders who can become advocates when they find the courage to act. The next time you witness injustice, remember Dolores Jefferson cleaning floors while building a case that would change lives. Remember that real power isn't always obvious, that real strength often works quietly, and that real change happens when ordinary people do extraordinary things in the service of justice. Don't wait for someone else to be the hero. Put on the uniform, do the work, and when the moment comes, and it will come, be ready to show them exactly who they're dealing with. Because dignity isn't negotiable, and justice never sleeps. It just sometimes wears a janitor's uniform. The story of Dolores Jefferson didn't end with Jennifer Walsh's termination, or even with the comprehensive reforms at Jefferson Holdings. Like all acts of genuine courage, it created ripples that spread far beyond their point of origin, touching lives and inspiring changes that none of the original participants could have anticipated. Within weeks of the viral video spreading across social media platforms, Dolores began receiving messages from workers across the country: janitors, food service employees, security guards, and countless others who labored in the shadows of corporate America. They shared their own stories of discrimination, of being treated as invisible, of enduring daily humiliations because they needed their paychecks more than they needed their pride. Maria Santos, a night cleaner in Dallas, wrote about how she had been forced to work through a broken ankle because her supervisor refused to believe she was injured. Who would believe a Mexican cleaning lady over a white manager? She had asked herself at the time. But after seeing Dolores's story, Maria filed a workers' compensation claim and contacted a labor attorney. Her case eventually led to an investigation that revealed systematic abuse of immigrant workers throughout the cleaning company. In Atlanta, 62-year-old James Washington had spent 5 years enduring racial slurs from a facilities manager who thought his comments were invisible because they happened in empty hallways after hours. James had documented everything in a journal he kept hidden in his locker, but never believed anyone would take his word over that of a college-educated administrator. Dolores's example gave him the courage to contact the EEOC, and his meticulous records became the foundation for a discrimination case that resulted in both financial compensation and policy changes at the university where he worked. The media attention surrounding Dolores's story also attracted the interest of Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist at Northwestern University who specialized in workplace inequality. She reached out to Dolores with a proposal that would expand the impact of her investigation exponentially. "What you did at Jefferson Holdings was brilliant," Dr. Williams explained during their first meeting. "But imagine if we could replicate it systematically across multiple industries. What if we could create a network of undercover investigators who could document discrimination where it actually happens, not just where people are willing to admit it exists?" The idea led to the formation of the Workplace Justice Initiative, a non-profit organization that trained volunteers to conduct undercover investigations of discriminatory practices. The program was carefully designed to operate within legal boundaries, focusing on documentation rather than entrapment, and partnering with established civil rights organizations to ensure that evidence gathered could be used effectively in legal proceedings. Dolores became the program's first director of field operations, drawing on her experience to develop training protocols that taught investigators how to observe, document, and protect themselves while gathering evidence of workplace discrimination. The program's first year resulted in successful interventions at 17 different companies, leading to policy changes that affected thousands of workers. But perhaps the most significant impact of Dolores's story was the way it changed conversations about power and visibility in American workplaces. Corporate executives who had never given much thought to their cleaning staff suddenly found themselves wondering who was really watching when they thought no one was looking. The possibility that any janitor, food service worker, or security guard might be more than they appeared created a new form of accountability. This shift in perspective led to what business journalists dubbed the Dolores effect, a measurable improvement in how service workers were treated across industries where her story had received significant attention. Companies began implementing policies that emphasized respect for all employees regardless of position, not just because it was morally right, but because the potential consequences of discrimination had become too visible and too costly to ignore. The transformation was particularly notable in Chicago's business district, where Dolores's story had originated. Building managers reported significant decreases in complaints about mistreatment of cleaning and maintenance staff. Security companies began requiring sensitivity training for guards who interacted with service workers. Even small changes, like ensuring that cleaning staff had access to the same break rooms and facilities as other employees, reflected a growing recognition that dignity wasn't something to be rationed based on job titles. Jennifer Walsh's fate became a cautionary tale that spread through professional networks with the speed of wildfire. Her inability to find employment in her field served as a stark reminder that in an era of social media and viral videos, acts of workplace cruelty could have permanent consequences. HR professionals began using her case study in training programs, not to mock her downfall, but to illustrate how unchecked bias could destroy careers and organizations. The legal ramifications extended far beyond Jennifer's personal consequences. The recordings Dolores had gathered became evidence in a class action lawsuit that resulted in one of the largest workplace discrimination settlements in Illinois history. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that made it easier for future victims of workplace discrimination to seek justice, particularly in situations where the discrimination was systemic rather than isolated. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Dolores Jefferson was invited to speak at the National Conference on Workplace Equality. Standing before an audience of labor leaders, civil rights attorneys, and corporate executives, she reflected on how a single moment of courage had grown into a movement that was still expanding. "When Jennifer Walsh slapped me that day," she told the audience, "she thought she was putting me in my place. What she actually did was reveal a truth that too many people had been content to ignore, that our workplaces are full of invisible people whose dignity matters just as much as anyone else's." She paused, looking out at faces that represented every level of the American economy. The question isn't whether discrimination exists. We all know it does. The question is whether we're willing to do something about it when we have the power to act. And every one of us has more power than we realize. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just appreciation for her words, it was recognition of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. In a society that often judges worth by wealth and values visibility over virtue, sometimes the most important revolution is the one that reminds us that every person matters, regardless of the uniform they wear or the work they do. Dolores Jefferson had started her investigation seeking to protect her son's company from discrimination lawsuits. She ended it by sparking a national conversation about dignity, respect, and the power that exists in every person who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. The cleaning lady who got slapped had become the catalyst for change that would protect countless workers who might otherwise have suffered in silence. And in boardrooms across America, executives were learning a lesson that would reshape how they thought about every employee in their organizations. You never know who's really watching, and you never know what they might do with what they see. In a world where justice can wear a janitor's uniform, the only safe approach is to treat everyone with the respect they deserve. Not because you have to, but because it's right.